Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, should Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand join forces on trade and security? We do a deep dive into CANZUK.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Hello and welcome to the Andrew Lawton Show, Canada's most irreverent talk show here on True North. Our Friday shows, you may know by now, we do a little bit differently. We don't talk about news of the day, but we take a big issue, a big question, and we delve down into it with the brightest minds assembled. Not me, but the people we bring on to talk about it. And today I want to talk about CANZUK. Might not be a word that ranks top of your lexicon, but it's one that's gaining a bit more influence and a bit more notoriety. It was in the last two Conservative election platforms. It would link the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada together. An agreement that would range from free trade, foreign policy cooperation, and any number of other things. That's one of the benefits of it. It would actually be a customizable and a malleable deal. You can kind of make from it whatever you want to make. And as we see a lot of the challenges that are coming about in getting countries to agree on things, is this the future of cooperation? Joining me is Stephanie Kusie, the Conservative Member of Parliament from Calgary, Midnapore, also a former diplomat and a member of the Political Advisory Board for CANZUK International. James Skinner, who's the founder and chief executive of CANZUK International. And Andrew Lilico, we've had him on the show before, the executive director of Europe Economics and a big proponent of the Leave campaign in the recent Brexit debate. Stephanie, James, Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So let me start with you on this, James, because I know that when people hear CANZUK, which certainly has a meaning in a lot of political wonky circles, but I don't know has necessarily entered the public consciousness yet. What are we talking about here? Is it a trade deal? Is it something akin to the European Union style relationship between countries? Or is it something entirely unique that we don't really have a model for in the world?
Yes, a good question. Thanks for having me on the show as well. So to sort of briefly describe CANZUK, what it effectively is an acronym between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And the name is essentially, was originally coined, I think, in the 1960s, but, in the last 5 years or so, it's really taken on a brand new meaning closer cooperation between these four countries. Essentially, if I was to sum it up briefly, I would say it mainly revolves around three pillars. The first being reciprocal migration of citizens between these countries. Free trade, so these nations can trade freely with goods and services, and foreign policy cooperation as well. And that would be things like educational initiatives, military collaboration, things like that. To your point, where is it something similar to the European Union? Absolutely not. I mean, taking free movement, for example, in the European Union, obviously citizens, about 500 million plus citizens in the EU are eligible to freely move between country to country, and there's very little checks across the borders there. With CANZUK, it's very much based upon the already existing agreement that Australia and New Zealand have called the Transtasman Travel Agreement. And what that basically means is that a New Zealander can live and work freely in Australia, and Australian can live and work freely in New Zealand. But there are commonsensical security measures in place. For example, you cannot do so if you have a criminal record. You cannot do so if you have a terrorist affiliation. You cannot do so if you have an infectious health condition. Lots of other conditions apply as well. So it effectively gives people that freedom to move between those two countries, while also implementing common sense approaches as well to, ensure there's safety and security for citizens. And the idea then is that, well, if these two countries have free trade, which they also do under the Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement, if they have free movement under the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, and they also work together, through foreign policy cooperation under Five Eyes and other agreements, why not have two other like-minded countries come onto that as well, being Canada and the UK? And I think by doing so, all four of these nations could work tremendously well together, offer freedom and opportunity and business incentives for citizens of all four of these countries, promote economic growth, and just give people general freedom to live and work in these countries too, which is a tremendous opportunity for everyone.
Stephanie, I know this was something the Conservatives championed in the last election in September. I know the Conservative leader, Aaron O'Toole, has been a big proponent of CANZUK for quite some time. Why is it something that you feel would benefit Canadians?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm a big fan of yours, and it was excellent to get to know you better through election 2021, primarily through the Spaces space, but it's a pleasure to be here, so thank you for having me. Well, as you said, our leader, Aaron O'Toole, has been a champion of this idea for some time, and it was actually placed within our policy at the 2018 convention in Halifax. And I was very proud to be at the mic there, putting it through as legislation for our party with the Honorable Ed Fast, who's also been a champion of CANZUK as well from our party. But I think what we really see with CANZUK is, and what is so appealing to myself and the entire Conservative movement and the Conservative Party of Canada, is really a return to solid values and foreign policy that we saw with the Harper administration, which has been sorely lacking in the Trudeau administration, I'd have to say. And this really is just a return to core values, including democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and the members of CANZUK are just a natural fit for these shared values. I think it's never been more important than it is now, certainly before the pandemic, with the sort of great power balance struggle, however you want to define it, in the world. I actually thought that would shift a lot more than it has post-pandemic, but it appears it's actually being intact. And I certainly know we could have another conversation about the changes we're seeing there, but really that's what it comes down to, is that Conservatives have always clearly identified our values when it comes to foreign policy, including movement of people, including trade. And that is, as I mentioned, democracy, human rights, the rule of law, free markets. And so supporting CANZUK is really supporting the values that guide our movement and our party.
Let me turn to you on this, Andrew, because James mentioned that there was a big boost of what we've seen between Australia and New Zealand, and a perhaps expansion of that CANZUK could bring to the UK and Canada. The big red flag there, of course, is geography. These are not countries that are as close to each other as Australia and New Zealand are. And I know that the geographic distance has been one of the bigger criticisms of CANZUK as far as, the integration of trade. It's not like the Canada-US border, for example, where you have more goods flowing across it than any other land border in the world. So why do these countries that are in some cases significantly far away have the ability to work together as closely as CANZUK would have them?
Well, I think, first of all, there are a couple of things to say about this. One is that people, I think, underestimate the extent to which in the modern world with modern communications, I mean, we're having a cross-border discussion even now that people can communicate, and so the tyranny of distance, as it were, has been diminished by modern technology. But I don't think really that's the main thing, because the main thing about CANZUK isn't so much how the CANZUK countries deal with each other. It's more how they as a group deal with the rest of the world. So when people think of these kinds of alliances and agreements, they tend to think of them by the model of something like the European Union, where the aim is to have a certain degree of internal self-sufficiency, so that the key thing is how much you trade with each other or how you do things together. But actually, the CANZUK is more a matter of how the CANZUK countries working together can face out to the rest of the world, how they make common cause on foreign policy questions on things like China. So, for example, there was a joint CANZUK select committee's letter about Hong Kong, complaining to the Chinese about that at the time. It's about questions like, so as well as dealing with that, it might be dealing in international regulatory spaces, perhaps agreements on climate change questions, or the regulation of the internet, or maybe recently the UK has joined together with Canada and Australia in a joint medical regulation group. You have the question of, there is a question of the internal integrity, and I think that can work well in the modern world, but also have this matter of how they all look out together. In fact, as James pointed out, originally CANZUK was coined in diplomatic circles to talk about the way in which the CANZUK group tended to caucus when they were voting on global questions. And part of the reason that the CANZUK group can do this is because they have such similar values and habits and natural affinities. And that also, because of those natural affinities, which obviously have a historic connection and origin, and also because of that historic origin, we even have direct, relations. Many of us have relations who live in each other's countries. There are 2 million people with British passports, for example, who live in Australia. So you have very large cross cross-country connections of that sort. And as going to a point that James made earlier, one of the key differences, I think, with something like the European Union is because of those natural affinities, you don't need to have the same kind of level playing field forcing so that everybody is forced to do exactly the same thing, because we will naturally be inclined to do things which are close enough that through our natural affinities we can work together without without needing specific legislation to make us do it.
I think that's a very important point there, Andrew, and I'll return to you on this, James. And I would add to it as well that if you're trying to get all the countries to agree on trade, you would have some difficulties there, some interest that might not be in alignment right away. And of course, that's all something you deal with in a negotiation. But then you add layers to it, like agreeing on security and agreeing on foreign policy, and it makes it a lot more complex. And one example of this that's very concrete is the Five Eyes Alliance, in which there's been some criticism of New Zealand and how it wants to have a relationship with China versus the direction that we see the UK and Canada to some extent going. So how do you overcome some of those hurdles if you have an agreement that is so integrated on so many different levels?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the obvious answer to that is obviously just, the tried and tested value of negotiation. I mean, you're absolutely right. In terms of Five Eyes, obviously New Zealand has, taken a bit of a different approach compared to Australia and the UK, especially with the new AUKUS deal. But, at the same time, obviously that's more around nuclear submarines and nuclear capabilities. And there's always going to be disagreements, no matter how closely akin you are and how much of a close affinity you have, you'll always have disagreements because every country has its own different values. But we're seeing that right now with the trade agreements that have been, negotiated between the UK and Australia and the UK and New Zealand. Those negotiations took some time. They weren't just straight off the bat, even though these three countries in particular, Canada's obviously going to have their trade agreement hopefully sometime next year. But these three countries, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, very closely aligned, very similar in terms of kinship and the Commonwealth membership and ancestry and things like that. But at the same time, those negotiations took time. And what we've seen now is that eventually the UK and Australia and the UK and New Zealand got round to agreeing those trade agreements. And what they've also said as well is that, okay, we've now got the trade agreement in place. We've laid the foundation. What we can now do moving forward is actually improve on those. And already Australia off the bat have been saying, well, okay, to do that, what we're going to consider is actually liberalizing visas between the UK and Australia. So, for example, instead of having it just as a simple 2-year visa, like I believe it is right now as it stands, that's going to be increased to a 3-year visa, and it's also going to increase the age limit from those under the age of 30 to those under the age of 35. And of course, what you can eventually do then, not just with Australia, but New Zealand and Canada as well, is eventually improve on that. So right now you might have a basic foundation to say 3-year visa for those under the age of 35. Well, what we can do, and obviously what CANZUK International intends to do, is to work with those MPs, work with those those cabinet ministers in each of those countries and say, well, there's actually added economic and sociological benefit to improving the age limit for those visas and improving the time length at which these people can stay in those countries. So it's all about negotiation, and it'll happen down the line. It certainly takes time, as everything in government does. But I'm very confident just by the rate of progress that we're making right now, it can be done, it will be done, and I think it's going to be beneficial for everybody in the long run.
Stephanie, one of the challenges that has been put towards CANZUK is that a lot of the things that a CANZUK agreement would bring are already in existence in some form. The Five Eyes is one notable example of this, but even some of the regulatory stuff you could deal with in a multilateral way without creating this new entity. So I guess the question is, what do you think the real draw is here that doesn't exist elsewhere?
I would say the real draw is, I think, the collaboration of all of these aspects under a single agreement. I'll point out again that, once again, the Harper administration really was the origin and the master of agreements historically. In fact, I had the honor of being in Peter Kent's office when he served as Minister of State for Foreign Affairs for the Americas, when the Canada-Chile agreement came out, for example. So I believe that we have a history of strong, comprehensive agreements, which really are for the benefit of Canada. And I certainly would add that we are not seeing this with the Trudeau administration, as is evidenced by the situation we have this week with softwood lumber. And Minister Ng is on her way to Washington as we speak, with my colleague MP Randy Hoback in tow, in an effort to try and alleviate this problem. So I think it goes back to what both Andrew and James were referring to, and that is really the history and the relationships. And, that's really what we have amongst the groups, is just respect for each other as a result of the values that I indicated previously, as well as the history, as Andrew was indicating in his response. But I think it's again going through these negotiations that James indicated, but for a comprehensive agreement, a comprehensive accord, which, as I said, was strong within the Harper administration and has been sorely lacking in terms of not even comprehensive agreements, but respectable agreements, respectable relationships between parties. And for all the reasons I've said previously, I think we can find this within the CANZUK group. And of course, I believe the Conservative Party would definitely be the best administration under which we could achieve the most for Canada.
Unlike NAFTA, which, well, I guess USMCA or CAUSMA or MUSCA, they change the name depending on which country you're talking about it in. But unlike this, which is more focused on the outcome, one thing that you've noted, Andrew, is that, and I'll quote you here, CANZUK could be as shallow or as deep as you choose to make it. So in a lot of ways, it's a framework within which you have a lot of latitude, more than it's a very specific thing. And I was wondering if you could extrapolate on that a bit.
Well, there are different, CANZUK is there's a broad church of different kinds of people who believe in the CANZUK type things. There are some who would only want to have a trade agreement and maybe foreign policy collaboration. There are others who would want at least the three pillars, which James has pointed out and that Erin O'Toole emphasized, and that you would then maybe build on those a little bit. There'll be others who would want to have something that was closer to the European Economic Community in concept. And of course, you can imagine, as with any of these things, there are those who would want to have a completely, fully federally integrated country, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. I don't mind having fellow travelers that don't necessarily.
Those are the ones who want a European Union military, I think, right?
Yeah, but they kind of the CANZUK equivalent of the people who want to have this European state. But I think all of that stuff is rather unrealistic at this stage. But I don't mind people who favour those things supporting us in the things that we're trying to achieve. And I think going back to something that James said, and indeed Stephanie emphasised as well, the ideal here, I think, would be to get to the UK and Canada acceding to the ANCERTA agreement between New Zealand and Australia, which is regarded as the gold standard, the best of all international free trade agreements, and to the Transtasman travel area, which is an absolutely a superb agreement for guaranteeing appropriate movement of peoples. Now, if we don't get, but I don't think that we should think that the types of progress that we make towards that constitute failure. If you don't get all the way there, then you've still got the CANZUK concept, because as much as anything, it's an idea of who you have as your geopolitical allies, who are your best mates in the world that you work with on a wide range of questions. The actual specific agreements that you have, somebody once put it to me like this, they said that it was the thing that lets you do the thing. The agreements that you have, the point, as much as anything, the point of them is that they're the framework within which you deal together with China, or deal together with, who knows, Trump again in the White House, or deal together with the European Union in international agreements, or in things like whatever the next climate change agreement is. So it's, or deal together with having a collaborative space program or something. So it's the thing which lets you do the thing. And the thing that lets you do the thing, ideally, I would see it as having the kind of depth that Stephanie and James want. But as James said, if we don't get all the way there in one step, I don't think that that's crucial. So you can have both this question of different people having different goals for how shallow or deep it is, but also you can have a progression through time. It isn't all or nothing. We can make it deeper, and then somewhere along the way, some people won't want to go any deeper, and other people will. But over time, we'll see what it is that in the future that we want to achieve. And I feel like we're making solid progress on this at the moment. It isn't in every CANZUK state, incidentally, a particularly partisan question. For example, in the UK, there's a huge cross-party support. The surveys have been done of MPs and of Lords. And in fact, there's a little bit more support amongst Labour MPs than there is amongst Conservative MPs. And the Conservatives are the administration here at the moment in the UK. So I think that it's worth noting. Obviously, the UK is negotiating a deal. It's a Conservative administration with New Zealand, with a Labour administration. So these things I know it's quite partisan in Canada, but in other parts of CANZUK, it's not especially partisan. And I think that may mean that if Canada can come around in the right sort of way, they'll be pushing at a fairly open cross-party door in the other parties.
Stephanie, let me ask you about that. Why does this seem like, in the media's interpretation of it in Canada, just this little conservative pet project that's of no interest to anyone outside of the Conservative caucus?
That's a great question. I just want to go back to one thing Andrew mentioned, that's the relationship between Canada and the UK. And actually, he reminded me that in fact, the first policy announcement in the 2019 election from Andrew Scheer, amongst the first, if you recall from that telephone booth, was a Canada-UK agreement. And so it is something that really transcends leaders within our party. I do believe that if I had to name something, I would say that it is seen as a Conservative initiative, I believe, even though it is something that would truly benefit all Canadians. I think that the government, as I said, they don't have guiding values. I believe that they are reactive. I don't believe that they have a list of nations where they are going down the list in an effort to create accords. I'm not even sure that they have identified the needs of Canada. It even appears to me sometimes at how these would be met through various accords throughout the world. So, I'm not going to give them a lot of credit in terms of even strategically thinking about benefits for Canada beyond CANZUK. But if I had to give a reason, it would absolutely be because this has essentially been a Conservative initiative, a Conservative passion, I would go so far as to say, because of the identified values that I mentioned previously of the Harper administration. And I think that's what makes the current administration, shy away from it, is that it would be impossible for them to put their mark on it. It would be incredibly difficult. It would be impossibly difficult for them to take credit for very difficult for the good that would come from such a relationship. And politics, definitely, it is a partisan sport for sure. Every day I sit in the House, I see it more and more with a few exceptions. And if I had to give a reason, that would be why, because it is rooted in the Conservative Party and would be very difficult for the current government to take credit for the so many benefits that would come from such an agreement.
It's a very insightful analysis of that, Stephanie. James, I'll ask you, looking at the labor movement, I don't mean the labor capital L in the UK or Australian context as far as a political party goes, but labor is in unions and workers' movements. How do they tend to respond to this? Because I know they're the groups that are often most resistant to free trade. You add into this free movement, and I could see it working out both ways there.
Yeah, it really does work out both ways. So we've had positive feedback and negative feedback from a lot of, say, union groups, labor administrations. You get some which say, well, if we're going to advance trade and, reciprocal migration between these countries, well, that puts a lot of workers at threat. Let's say you've got a British labor organization in the United Kingdom, for example, and they've got a bunch of Canadians coming over. They see that as, well, there could be a bunch of Canucks coming over to the UK to take our jobs, and that's not a good thing. But then you also get a lot of associations as well who are very supportive of it, to say, well, part of CANZUK is that, one of the things we advocate for is mutual skills mutual skills recognition between the countries. So, for example, if you are a architect in Canada and you want to go and live and work in Australia, well, what you have to do right now is that when you arrive in Australia, you no longer have a valid credential to do architecture or any profession really. If you're a plumber, you're an electrician, what you have to do in Australia is you then have to convert over your skills and credentials to what the Australians deem as valid and collaborative with their educational standards. And that can set you back years of training, can also set you back thousands of dollars right now. But under CANZUK, what we're saying is that, well, if you've got, say, a doctor in Canada and you want to go and practice in New Zealand, well, hop on a plane, go to New Zealand, maybe do, I don't know, a month or 2 months worth of, switch over testing so you can actually comply with New Zealand laws. And then, straight away you can be a doctor because, last time I checked, a human body in New Zealand is pretty much exactly the same as a human body in Canada. So why not have that easy flow of people coming from Canada to New Zealand to the United Kingdom to Australia, and so on and so forth. Saves people thousands of dollars, years of time retraining. So you get a lot of associations like that, especially in the legal community, who say, well, if I can be a lawyer in the UK, why can't I be a lawyer in Australia? Especially as we have, very similar common law. We have the Westminster style parliamentary system. There's a couple of differences here and there, which of course would require a bit more training and, certain educational credentials to be added on top of that, but nowhere near to the degree where we have right now, where a lot of people have to go and train for 4 or 5 years. They have to spend thousands of dollars and it's just not worth their time. So you get some, to answer your original question, you get some labor movements, some labor organizations who say, well, no, we don't support this because trade could pose a threat to our workers. It could pose a threat to our way of life. And, those are valid concerns as well. But I think the benefits of what you get with CANZUK in terms of, the trade dynamics, and also as well, the mutual skills recognition, the freedom that gives people, the cost saving that gives people, the economic opportunity that gives these countries as well, whereby you get skilled migrants from all 4 of these countries, a massive labor market pool to go to any one of these other 4 countries where they can practice their trade or practice their profession without having to spend thousands of dollars and years of time. I think those benefits far outweigh the negatives, which is what, a few labor movements are saying. So overall, I think it's a general massive plus for everybody involved.
Andrew, I know when NAFTA was being renegotiated to become the deal we have now, there was, of course, the obvious discourse around who's winning and who's losing it. And this was certainly amplified by the Trump administration at the time, saying that the U.S. was really the big loser of that deal. And if you bring this now into a CANZUK context, is there going to be a clear winner in this? Is there going to be a country of the group that it's benefiting more than the others? And does that work against making it politically viable?
I would say that it benefits all of the countries, and it also benefits the rest of the world, having the benefit of us working together for them. So that seems to me to be the key thing about that. And in terms of, look, there's the details of trade agreements. It depends, of course, on how large movements are. And people have emphasized when you had the UK-Australia trade agreement, there have been claims by people that the Australians have gained more than the UK out of the deal, or what the Australian farmers and so on. I don't think that obviously people are going to say those kind of things. I don't think that that's particularly influential upon the debate. These agreements are so overwhelmingly popular amongst the general population that all of that kind of stuff, I think, really gets swept aside. And I think there's also the migration point is also overwhelmingly popular. In opinion polls, the UK is actually the least popular. In the UK, the idea of migration, but even in the UK, it's 68%. I think in the most recent poll, it was the support for CANZUK. And when you go to Canada, what's 5-1 support, I think, Australia 7-1, New Zealand 8-1 support for free movement. And one of the things with that is, and I think it also goes back to some of the business with the unions and the politicians as well. It's not that if really amongst any of these peoples, there's any resistance to the idea of movements, amongst the CANZUK peoples. Everybody knows that that's popular. Everyone thinks that would be a good idea. What they worry about is that if they agree to that, they'll also have to agree to movements from lots of other people. Otherwise, there'll be or either they'll feel like they have to agree to that, or if they don't agree to that, then they're worried about exactly what the critique is from various sorts of historical baggage. You can imagine the last thing any Australian administration wants to be accused of is returning to a white Australia policy, and the last thing that the UK will want to do would be to have open borders to the entire world. So there's a question of how the politicians reconcile to themselves the question of having these specific agreements. And actually, the business of having specific trade agreements is a useful hook here, because what's happened in both the UK, Australia and UK, New Zealand trade agreements is that they've included an element of visa easing. And I think that idea that you connect them in some way, even though they're not really conceptually all that connected, but at least it gives you an excuse. So then if you don't have a trade agreement with India or Nigeria or something, then you can say, oh, well, obviously we don't have one, so we don't have these provisions. And that allows you to achieve that end, I think, but even though it's a little bit artificial. One other thing, I think that the politicians will get there in terms of a spin, because in terms of the support for these things, it's an absolute psephologist's dream. There can be no policy which is as overwhelmingly popular as the idea of CANZUK free movement. Even in the UK, where it's the least popular, absolutely every demographic, it has majority support. Every age group, every social demographic, every region of the country, this is a policy which has majority support. So the politicians, it's like, of policies which are not already in play, it must be the most universally popular policy which anybody is suggesting at the moment. And the politicians just have to find a way to unlock that key. One last thing I'll say on this is, one of the things which has complicated this in the past few months, obviously, has been the COVID pandemic. Because once you don't really have much moving around at all, and especially when you have very aggressive restrictions, as in Australia and New Zealand, the question of movement and the advantages of movement becomes less high up on the agenda. And it also probably becomes less high up on the agenda for Aussies and New Zealanders. I mean, all that business where people used to go off on a gap 2 or 3 years. Well, they've not been doing that for the last couple of years, have they? So I think that will come back once we get past the business of COVID. That kind of pressure for movement amongst these peoples will come back on the agenda again.
Yeah, Australians are I think, still fighting for movement within their own country right now, let alone elsewhere. But just on the note of movement, very quickly, Andrew, wasn't the free movement one of the biggest hurdles that the Leavers had to overcome? Because that was a very popular sentiment through the Brexit debate for even people that would have been on side with the Leave campaign elsewise, wouldn't they?
Well, free movement amongst CANZUK countries is extremely popular amongst Leavers. Free movement wasn't even all that unpopular within the EU when it was free movement amongst countries with fairly similar GDPs. When you were talking about France and Germany and Spain and Italy and countries where there'd been pretty much free movement for 3,000 years between Britain and those bits of the continent, nobody had any objections to those kinds of things at all. Once you started to try to bring in countries where the GDP per capita was only 1/4 and lower and less of the level, so that movement no longer became a matter of mutual migration, as it is in CANZUK, with people moving both ways, but all a matter of how many you let in. That concept of free movement becomes something completely different, and that, of course, doesn't exist at all in the CANZUK setting. People would move in both ways, and everybody from all of the CANZUK countries understands the idea that there'd be advantages in being able to go, as well as advantages in having the people come to you.
That's a very, very important distinction. Just as we wind down here, I'll ask you, Stephanie, and I'll ask you as well this question, James. We saw Canada excluded from AUKUS, which I know is a security-specific deal within the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. This was something the Conservatives in Canada were quite frustrated about during the last election. But does this agreement threaten CANZUK in a way? Not because it tries to do the same thing, but it creates relationships that still have the United States very heavily involved.
I think what it does is it actually emphasizes the terrible position that Canada is in the world at this time, and what a fall we've seen from 2015. So I think it's more important we look at the meaning of it outside of the two agreements themselves, because ultimately when we're considering foreign policy and certainly security. It should be with objectives and ends in mind. So I don't think we should be thinking about the form that this would take, or this over this, or because that happened, this isn't going to happen. I think it just highlights the dire situation that Canada is in currently on the world stage, just the lack of disrespect and disregard that is shown to our nation and our leadership at this time. And to go back to James' point about migration, I'll tell you, as the Shadow Minister for Employment, Future Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, we have 1 million job vacancies in Canada right now. And this, of course, is precipitated by the pandemic and the difficulty of moving people from benefits back to jobs, but also an aging work population, but also a failed immigration system, again, through the Trudeau administration over the last 6 years. And with Harper, it was always on an eye as to the economy, the future economic benefit of Canada, which of course benefits all Canadians. But again, another example of this government's failure of the execution of foreign policy, be it security, as you're referring to in this question, Andrew, or immigration, as James was discussing. But it all goes back to the values that a nation holds, and that these values are used as the guiding principles for interactions with all nations on all levels.
And James, will give you last word on this.
Yeah, it's. I think it comes back. This is just my perception. I'm open to being right or wrong about this, but I think it comes back to the sort of the different values that these governments have. Me personally, I don't think it's a coincidence that in terms of the AUKUS deal, which is Australia, the UK, and the USA, I don't think it's any coincidence that, the Australia and the UK have, I would say, right of centre governments, and Canada and New Zealand have left of centre governments in terms of participating in that. So traditionally, and again, maybe I'm stereotyping, I'm open to being wrong about this, but I find those who are right of centre in politics tend to favour nuclear capabilities, a strong military. Those left of centre, not so fussed on nuclear capabilities. And I think that played a big part in Canada, perhaps not being part of it. In terms of the USA, whether that would perhaps threaten CANZUK, I don't think so. But again, it's an interesting question and somewhat philosophical in nature as well. What we at CANZUK International advocate for is strong foreign affairs collaboration between these four nations. And of course, part of that is, working together on military capabilities. Now, statistically, if Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom were to work together on their military capabilities, not combine them, obviously just acting as nation states working together, they would in fact have the third largest military capability in the world. I think somewhere in the region of about $130 billion. And that's only after the USA and China. Now, would the USA see that perhaps as a threat to the sort of hegemony to, military capability? Possibly, but would they also see it as a complement to perhaps keep, adversarial actors like China, Iran, North Korea in check? Maybe so. So the USA could potentially see CANZUK as a complement to the work they're trying to do in terms of promoting democracy, human rights, peace, stability around the world. They could see it as a threat, but I think the USA would probably welcome the idea of CANZUK, especially in terms of a foreign affairs capability, and especially, having the USA being a major superpower, having CANZUK, working together as the third largest military capability in the world. I think that would do wonders in terms of promoting international stability and peace, and especially keeping adversarial actors like China, like the Chinese Communist Party in check in that way. So it's an interesting question. It's very philosophical in nature, but overall, I think the USA, I don't think it would be a threat in terms of CANZUK. I think probably the USA would probably welcome the idea.
That's a good point, and it goes back to what Andrew said earlier about the importance of not only looking at CANZUK internally, but also externally, and how this bloc would then interact with the world on trade and security. So great points all around. I want to give a big thank you to Conservative MP from Calgary, Midnapore, Stephanie Kusie, former diplomat and a member of the advisory board for CANZUK International, James Skinner, founder and chief executive of CANZUK International, and Andrew Lilico, the executive director of Europe Economics. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, all of you, for joining.
Thank you.
And with that, my thanks also to those of you who watched the panel. It's great. I mean, I love chatting with these people, but I don't think I would get them to agree to do it if no one was watching. Then again, you never know. But regardless, I appreciate you tuning in, and I appreciate the panelists sharing their time and insights. That does it for me for this week. We'll be back next week with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show here on True North. This is The Andrew Lawton Show. Thank you, God bless, and good day.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.